So as I've already said, we're coming to the end. In fact, we've already come to the end of our series in Ezra. And so I thought I'd do a kind of a quick recap of what we've already looked at, a sort of previously in this series kind of thing. And so firstly, you might remember that we thought about how, although some of the exiles returned to the land, not all of them did, not by kind of a long chalk. And so in many ways, the exile is still ongoing. God's people, and that means me and you, we still find ourselves in strange places, in a land that is not meant to be this way. And just as with the exiles in Babylon, we should remember that God is always with us, and allow ourselves to dream of and then to work towards a home where God's perfect rule and reign is as it is in heaven. And then we thought about some of the different and varied characters that God used to bring the exiles back into the promised land and to aid them with the rebuilding of the temple. And we thought about some of the different ways and people that God might use to work in our community today, remembering to look out for those places where God is already at work, rather than allowing ourselves to believe that he's just kind of sat there waiting for us to do his work for him. And then, as we read about the temple being kind of finally being completed and dedicated to God, we thought about what it was that the temple stood for, this idea that it was where heaven and earth overlapped. And then about how Paul in the New Testament describes us as being the new temple, both individually as followers of Jesus and collectively as the church, both here in Bacup and the church worldwide. And about how then we ought to dedicate ourselves to God in the way that the Jews dedicated the rebuilt temple. And we celebrated with Soraya last week, didn't we? As she did just that through the waters of baptism, publicly promising to follow and to serve God in all that she does. And finally, we looked at the example of Ezra. And we thought about the importance of having the word of God at the heart of who we are, and more importantly, at the heart of what we do. And so, as we've thought about this idea of coming out of exile, and that's the reason that I chose to preach on the book of Ezra, this theme of coming out of exile, we've seen this move for the returning Jews, where they began to see that being in the land and worshipping in the temple, the things that they've kind of been dreaming about whilst they've been in exile in Babylon, are in fact only very small pieces of the overall picture. And actually they mean very little without that desire to follow, to love and to serve God in the world. And I think that might be helpful for us too, to remember, as we might identify in some ways with those who returned from Babylon. I mean, we're now able to worship together in the building, aren't we? We're able to sing, to have a chat over tea and coffee at the end of the service, and a whole host of other little things that actually we've really missed at different points over the last couple of years. But we need to remember that those things are only small pieces of the overall picture. And in and of themselves, they're actually fairly insignificant without the desire to walk with God through the rest of our lives when we're not here together in this building. as we think about baptism, and it's been on my mind because we had a baptism last week, I'd encourage those of you who have been baptized to remember the promises that you made at your baptism. The promise to live within the fellowship of the church and to serve Jesus Christ in the world. And then to continue to look for ways in which we can live out those promises. And for those of you who perhaps haven't yet been baptized, I wonder, is God calling you to move closer to him now? Is now the time that you feel ready to dedicate yourself publicly to him? To make those promises in front of your friends and your family? If so, then please do come and talk to me. I think we've been really blessed over the 5 years that I've been here with you. We've had a number of baptisms. It's been a fairly regular occurrence, and I'm sure before that as well. But certainly in the 5 years that I've been here, it's been a real blessing to see that. But do you know what? I'm greedy. I'd love to see more. We had a kind of local ministers' meeting recently, and Johnny Hurst from K Street, we were talking about baptism, and he said, wouldn't it be great to just have the baptism open kind of all the time? To have to come to church in your swimming shorts because you might be getting in that day. Yeah. So like I say, if you think that you're being kind of nudged by God in that way, you think that maybe baptism is something that you want to consider, then come and talk to me about it. I'd love to talk to you about it. And all of that is a kind of very long preamble into this week's passage. But the theme is much the same. We saw that last week, Ezra, having finally made an appearance in the book that's named after him, comes to Jerusalem to teach the scriptures amongst the people there. But actually, in the book of Ezra at least, we don't get any real reports of him doing any teaching. There's kind of mention of it when you get into the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah chapter 8 talks about Ezra the teacher. But here in Ezra 9 and 10, the last two chapters of the book of Ezra, his focus is to help the Israelites to sort out an issue that is threatening their walk with God and which is leading them away from God. We're told, and we heard it read in our passage, that the officials come to Ezra and they report that the people have not kept themselves separate from the other nations that are living around them, as they were commanded to, and have instead they've married people from within the other people groups that were living in and around Jerusalem. Now, it's worth probably just stopping for a moment to think about this and to try and understand it properly, because this passage and others like it in the Bible have, in my opinion at least, been kind of misapplied by the church down the years and used to teach kind of things along the lines that, proper Christians are only really permitted to marry other believers. And that then, in turn, I think has led, in some cases at least, to people feeling either that they're forced to choose between God and their family, or even sometimes being trapped in marriages that aren't loving or healthy. And so I think it's important to say that marriage in that time and place is not and was not the same as we understand marriage today. In fact, actually, it might be more accurate to say that our 21st century kind of Western idea of marriage is actually the sort of oddity. That's the outlier. If you look back through history and even at some kind of cultures in the world today, even our idea of marriage is the one that stands apart. You see, for us, the point of marriage is love, isn't it? we meet the person that we fall in love with and with whom we want to spend the rest of our lives. And then we promise to do just that by standing in front of our family and friends and making our wedding vows. And if we're lucky, then that love does last for the rest of our lives. And we do stay together. But we recognise, of course, don't we, that that's not always the case. And then we have systems in place for those times when it doesn't work out the way that we hope it would. But as I've already said, as we look back through history, this idea of marrying for love is something of an oddity. It's a fairly new occurrence. It certainly wasn't the system that was in place back in kind of 450-ish BC, which is when Ezra was dealing with this issue. For those people, marriage was kind of more of a business transaction, if you like. Marrying into the right family might help you to kind of gain status, political or social influence, or even wealth. Or it could be used to kind of cement relationships between different communities, to bring peace between kind of warring factions. Or perhaps to provide the context in which children or women were looked after. Or maybe even just to ensure that your sons would start a family who could then help you to look after your land and who would continue on your sort of family lineage. There were all sorts of reasons why you might get married, but falling in love was not really one of them. And anyway, kind of marriage was a sort of family business. You didn't really get to choose who you wanted to marry. It talks later on in the chapter in Ezra 9 about kind of taking wives for your sons or giving your daughters in marriage. Because it was the parents who decided. It was a business transaction. It helped the family for you to marry that person. And so by arranging marriages for their sons and their daughters with those from neighbouring people groups, presumably in return for promises of security or status or wealth, the Israelites were not only endangering the very existence of Israel, which by this point had kind of been reduced to just a very small remnant, but they were also showing that they were kind of putting those things ahead of their desire to follow God's commandments. And additionally, they were sort of putting their trust for things like security and for their provision in the people that surrounded them, rather than in the God who had brought their ancestors out of exile. The other thing I think to note here is that is different is how we kind of understand family dynamics. Just to give you an example, Rachel Livermore, who is our newest deacon, when she was nominated to be a deacon, she sent me an email promising that she would only kind of share her own viewpoints and her own opinion. She would only speak on her own behalf, to kind of reassure me that she wasn't being used by kind of David as his mouthpiece, as his kind of way back on to the diaconate. Not that that would have been an issue even if it were. But in my response to her, I did point out that, I had met them both before, and so not for one moment would I ever consider that David could use her in that way, even if he wanted to. But you see, our understanding of kind of couples and families is that we are individuals, aren't we? We're linked together and we're part of a whole, yes, but we're also autonomous. And we exist in our own right too, don't we? With our own opinions and thoughts and personalities. But again, that 21st century Western idea of a family is something of an oddity and an outlier. And so back in Ezra's day, certainly, as with much of history, and I think even today some cultures around the world, the family unit exists purely as a whole, inextricably tied together in virtually every way. And so if I were to say something or to do something, either good or bad, then it would reflect on my family as a whole, and would therefore bring either honour or shame to my parents, my grandparents, my children, my wife, because what I do affects the whole. And it was the same for all members of the family. What one member of the family did affected the whole. And Ezra 9, I think, makes clear that it is not intermarriage itself which is the problem, but rather the religious adherence of the couples involved. You see, if one of the married couple worships another god, or practices divination, or wanted to sacrifice one of their children to their god, then that would affect the whole household. Now, I'd like to think that even today, if a parent wanted to sacrifice a child, it might affect the whole household in some way. But what one member did affected the whole. And not just that nuclear family, but it affected previous generations and future generations too. Because the family unit as a whole is inextricably tied together. And so then, as we then think about our own situations, perhaps we might see in ourselves areas where we have put something ahead of God. Maybe status, money, popularity, whatever it might be. And perhaps we might also recognise those times where we've tried to kind of compartmentalise our lives, believing that what we do over here doesn't affect our walk with God over there. And you know what, if that is the case, that we do recognise those things in ourselves, well then I just want to share something that a friend of mine used to say all the time, and I'll finish with this. He used to say that God doesn't want to move just into our spare room, but rather he wants to move in to the whole house. He wants full access to every part of our lives, to every little nook and cranny. But more than that, he doesn't want just access. He wants to remodel, to make new, to revitalise. And he can't do that if we keep him locked away in just the spare room and only go and visit him on a Sunday. So let's throw open the doors. Let's hand over the keys. Let's be a people who devote ourselves fully to God with no compromises and no exceptions, promising to live within the fellowship of the church and to serve Jesus Christ in the world.